Welcome to the Bible Passages Podcast.
Paul's been in the Agora talking about Jesus, talking about the resurrection of the dead.
This episode is part 2 of a 2-part series on the city of Athens.
People hear, he's setting forth strange gods. We've never heard about this. Who's he talking about? What's going on here?
Today, we're talking about Mars Hill, one of the most famous landmarks mentioned in the book of Acts.
Paul came and addressed the fundamental issues of life.
We hope you'll enjoy this episode of the Bible Passages Podcast.
He is a God of righteousness and judgment, and he's a God that came in the person of Jesus Christ, God dwelling among us. Can you imagine?
Hello, and welcome back to the Bible Passages Podcast. We're here with another episode today, and the first thing we need to get out of the way is this will be part 2 of our episode on Athens. We're going to be spending an entire episode talking about the Areopagus and Mars Hill. And as usual, I'm here with John. How are things going today, John?
Great. Just been busy and just got back from a great lectureship at the Bear Valley Bible Institute on igniting the church's love for preaching. And that was a great lectureship. Been going down on Wednesday nights to the University Congregation in San Marcos, Texas, and teaching a couple of classes there on Wednesday nights on Bible, geography, and archaeology. So then, of course, got to see the grandkids this weekend. That was great, and loved that. And got to visit with some folks that have been on a trip of ours to the Bible lands. And that's one of the great things about going on those trips is that, you know, you connect with a lot of people and you instantly make friends and become family. And it's just, you grow together, you learn together, and then there's just bonds that are built that really last a lifetime. So, yeah, lots going on. What about you?
It's been good. I don't know if you know, but we had Michael and Christy stayed with us. They're another couple that went on the tour with us, and they stayed with us for the lectureship, and their 2 boys, and we really had a good time. So it's been really good. Everything's been going well.
Yeah. Well, good. Yeah, we got to see you guys, and that was an added blessing. And so I know we got a lot of work to do, a lot of things to even talk about today. So much to do, and so little time. So I guess we better get to it, huh?
Well, yeah, we. If you watched the previous episode, I hope that you've gone back and done that. But you will know that we kind of cut midstream because we were going long-winded, which never happens to us. But we were going long, and we wanted to give diligence to this episode specifically because what happens on Mars Hill, what happens with Paul's speech in Acts 17 is there's really a lot going on there. So I think the best place to start is probably just talking about, well, first, let's reset where we are in Athens. So if you're coming into Athens from the north, let's say, in the modern city, the first ancient thing you'll come to is the Agora, the Greek marketplace. We talked a lot about that. And then up the hill a little ways is the Areopagus, what we're going to be talking about today. And then up and to your left, what would be to your left, is the Acropolis. And that's, of course, where the large temples are. And so the Areopagus, which we're talking about today, really sits in kind of this middle city. It's higher than the Agora and where the marketplace was, but it's slightly lower than the Acropolis. And that is the place where Paul was taken in Acts 17. And I think we mentioned this last time, but maybe to get this out of the way very quickly, John, there's some debate about whether he actually went to that hill or he went someplace else. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, the Areopagus was basically a council, and but it had its roots maybe to legitimize it in some way, all the way back to Greek mythology, associated with that hill that said that the god of Ares or Ares was put on trial there for attempted murder, and but he was exonerated. And anyway, and then there are other things that I've read about in recent weeks about that particular hill connected to a place where judgments were made. And so going back even before real grassroots democracy, so that was the mythological part of it. And then going back to the time before Greece really developed into a democracy, a council of elders, as it were, people that were chosen from the various maybe tribal entities in and around Athens were allowed to be able to make judicial decisions on a number of things. But so some connected it to that hill and that that's where they met. And then others say that it actually became an institution that met at the Stoa or at a Stoa down below in the Agora somewhere. So it was an institution, but an institution that, got its name from that hill, the hill of Ares. So the Areopagus. And by the way, you'll read in some Bibles that it's called what? Remember?
Yeah, Mars Hill. And the confusion there, Ares is well, I'm gonna get them mixed up here, but Ares is either the Greek or Roman name, and then Mars is the other one,
Yeah,
either Greek or
Ares is
Roman.
the Greek, and then and then Mars is the Roman. That's the Roman god of war, and so and Ares is the Greek god of war. So yeah, that's why some translations from the Roman perspective will say it's Mars Hill as opposed to the Areopagus. But yeah, so anyway, I don't know if that answers kind of your question about that, but that's
Well, it absolutely does, and I think, two really important things that I think need to be understood about this place. First, it is a place, but it's also a council. I use the illustration in the last episode. It's like the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court meets in the Supreme Court building, they could meet somewhere else. They'd still be called the Supreme Court. So much like the Areopagus, if they're not meeting on the hill, they'd still be called the Areopagus. And so some scholars think that maybe Paul wasn't taken there. I think most of my reading indicated that the text reads like Paul was taken to that hill itself. It's really immaterial. The point is that he's standing in front of this council, and the council has. You mentioned the mythological roots. I think there are two important things that need to be understood about the history. The first is that mythological trial. So, without getting too far in it, as far as I understand it, Ares was actually put on trial there. Again, this is the mythological explanation. He was put on trial there, and his accusation was the murder of the son of Poseidon. And the question became whether or not that was justified or whether he would become exonerated. And again, with any mythological story, there's about 15 variations of it. But it's important to mention that because that is how the Athenians saw this place. It's a place of trial, and specifically of capital offenses. And there was another really important person who was tried there, and that was Socrates. So you want to talk a little bit about Socrates?
well. I mean, yeah. I mean, I know we were just mentioning that probably twice now about what all was going on there, but that's okay too. But Socrates, yeah, I mean, he was accused of setting forth new ideas, of stirring up young people, and I'm not as well versed about Socrates as I need to be, but I do know that his influential thinking, his philosophical ideologies, as he taught in the Agora and different places, and really challenging the thinking of the day and sort of upsetting the apple cart, as it were, as far as Athenian life and Athenian beliefs and views. And so because he's put on trial there, and then eventually, drinks the, takes the hemlock and dies. It's a judgment, right? That's taking place with regard to his life and a capital offense that as they were viewed it. And then Paul comes along and he's upsetting the apple cart, right? He's now setting forth strange ideas and stirring up things in the city that seem to be, counter to what Athenian life or views or Greek philosophy and ideologies are about. In particular, one of which has to do with the teaching about the resurrection, and that flies in the face of a lot of mainstream Greek philosophical ideology, because as Plato would say, and the ideas of the Platonic thought that this world is just sort of a crummy shadow of what is really the real, and the real is these are forms of the real ideals that exist out there, and that this body is just a sort of representation of the real essence of something that's true. And so to think that this body would somehow be resurrected and that there was a resurrection, because in Greek philosophy and Greek thought, then the emancipation of the soul was sort of what heaven was like. to divorce yourself from this material world. And so now Paul's saying, no, there's a resurrection, that the body can come back. And there's much more to all of that, even with regard to Jesus coming back from the grave and all of that. But so now you're setting forth a strange idea like Socrates. And so some ways, and some commentators, some scholars see that, there's sort of this reminiscent, view about that. So.
Well, and as I've studied and as I understand it, Socrates was actually charged formally with introducing foreign gods. And so one of the things that kind of really struck me as I started to study is, Paul may be in real danger here. He's going through Athens and he's talking about a new deity, and one of the things that he could have been doing with the unknown god, which we'll talk about here in just a second, but is utilizing the Athenian establishment to then teach them about the one true living God, and he's going to play a lot on their thought and what they already understood. But a lot of scholars, and you mentioned this, set up a parallelism between Socrates and Paul. They think that Luke is drawing on these themes of this well-known trial. It's at the same place. It arguably has the same charge. It has a lot of the same feeling, and so Luke is trying to paint Paul as the new Socrates, and so that helps us maybe understand a little bit of what's going on in this trial.
Why do you think he would be painting him as the new Socrates? What is significant about that? I mean,
I don't I hadn't given that much thought. I know that the
well, the only reason I guess I was just asking because some people are going to say, well, why is that important? Bringing that up and making mention of that. And I don't know for sure either, except to say that it really creates or shows this tension, and also the challenge against the formal sort of traditional thinking of the day, which Christianity is going to challenge those foundational ideologies and thought processes of the day, and to see Paul going in there and being willing to do that and to sacrifice himself if need be. He made mention of that when on his way to Rome when he was at Caesarea. I'm not ready just to be bound, but to be cast into prison, but to die for the name of the Lord Jesus. And so Socrates was willing to do that. And I think Greek philosophy and Greek ideology, Greek thinking, Greek way of life would have, in fact, considered that to be, the ideal person. Wow, someone who's willing to sacrifice themselves, to stand on their values, and to champion the cause of something that they believed in. But anyway, I don't know if that's it or not, but I was just curious what you thought.
well, and I think there's maybe even two more reasons that that kind of sparked a thought in my mind. One of the things that I think Luke is trying to do in part is establish the legitimacy of this new doctrine. Kind of like, again, I'll go back to the Supreme Court analogy. If you and I are having a fight over our fence row, that's not going to end up in the Supreme Court. It's a trial worthy of the Areopagus is one of severity. And so in one way, Luke is showing that this is a something to be taken seriously, something to be legitimized, something that the Athenians themselves were taking seriously. And so to be tried in the same place as Socrates, right? They took Socrates very seriously. Well, they're taking Paul at least somewhat seriously, either as a threat or as a philosophical leader, depending on what side they landed on. And then the other thing is that kind of like what you were talking about, is Socrates was really seen as somebody who was willing to stand for what he believed in, right? Paul becomes more like Christ every step he takes towards his death. He's suffered, he's afflicted, he's beaten and willing to go even to death to defend the cause of Christ.
Yeah.
So I think those two things are
Yeah. Challenging
important
the
in that regard.
establishment, kind of challenging the
Yes.
establishment as well, and thinking, which had, and maybe this would be a good segue into kind of where you want to go next, hopefully, but and that is because so many of the things that are institutionalized in terms of the thinking of the day, they imprison people in many ways, or They rob people of a lot of what could be enjoyed in terms of blessings and hopes. And I think, thinking about all of the gods, even during the time of Socrates and now especially Paul, that are being worshipped, think about how enslaving that is. But we'll get there. I don't know if that's where you want to go next or not, but go ahead. So,
No, well, I'm don't know. My thought here was let's just kind of jump in and talk about each of these pieces of the speech in turn. Um, I think one of the neat things that we'll see as we go through is how much Paul is playing on the political, the religious, the geographical setting of where he is. It is not a haphazard chance that he's just going to go through and pull out, whatever application he had ready. He's really drawing upon the situation that he's in. One more thing before we get into that, though, I did want to talk briefly about the Stoics and the Epicureans. Um, so the Stoics and Epicureans, John, I'll give you first thought on that, and then I have a few ideas.
well, I don't, the thing that we risk, and I thought about this as we were, getting ready for this podcast, is that, man, we could get so bogged down in the philosophical ideologies about that and miss some of the important things associated with what's being said here. And also, we've got to come back and talk about the altar to the unknown God. We can't forget about that because that's the basis on which Paul then forms a lot of his speech. But what we do need to recognize, and what you're talking about there, is the context of all of this. Paul came and addressed the fundamental issues of life that Stoicism and Epicureanism was seeking to do. What is life about? And that's an important question that everybody, I think, at some point in their life, generally asks: Why am I here? Who am I? Where am I going? And how should I treat life? Well, if you don't believe in the multiplicity of gods in the Greek pantheon, um, then what do you believe? And even if you do believe in those, well, what is my purpose in this life? And so Epicureanism and Stoicism basically is trying to give a rational sort of systematic approach to how to endure suffering, how to deal with life, what extremes do you go to, how to enjoy life. In essence, they are philosophical approaches to answering those questions. And so, I don't know if you want to just maybe summarize what each of those is about, or their approach, or if it even matters at this point. But that's essentially what we need to keep in mind when we're coming to the text.
Well, and I don't want to. I'm very much in on your side here. We don't want to get into Stoicism and Epicureanism. I think the points of note are one, exactly what you said is right. These are people who are debating the important questions in life, and one of the things that Paul's going to do is he's going to enter that debate at a scholarly level, right? He's going to quote from their own scholars, he's going to engage with their own ideas, and then he's going to make a reasoned argument for a new philosophy. And so he doesn't just dismiss their eh, philosophies out of hand. He engages with them in that way. And I think the other thing that is worth noting, and again, you can do a study on Stoicism and Epicureanism. They not necessarily don't get along, but they don't get along. They
Mhm.
definitely see the world completely opposite ways, and so we're in the midst of this very polarizing debate. Paul's going to enter in, and he's going to say, "Well, have you considered this? Have you considered this? Have you considered this? There's a God out there that satisfies some of the things that you've noticed about your world, and I want to correct your philosophy through instruction."
Yeah. Well, and I think that is so important, Brian, to remember that Paul, as we've already noted in the previous section, came to Athens and his spirit was stirred within him. He was angry. Why? Because he saw a city wholly given to idolatry. So there's one philosophical viewpoint of people who were enslaved to, who were being robbed of their happiness in many ways, to this, Greek religious idea of that we are just a subset of the larger subset of things going on in the world out there, and that the Greek pantheon is the real world, and that we are just, a lesser being, and that we're slaves to these um, sort of aloof gods. All right, so there's one. So highly religious. It is ingrained in every aspect of the life of Greek, and then of course Roman later thinking and ideas, in terms of, see it there all in the Stoa, Stoa. Everywhere you go in the Agora of all these temples. Okay, so there's that. And then, well, if we don't necessarily think about Greek mythology as being real, or if it's not really satisfying or giving an answer to man's existence, then what do we turn to? So people like Socrates and Aristotle and Plato give the world, the Greek world, at least at that time, and then for centuries to follow, and for even today, another paradigm out of which to operate, to give meaning and purpose to life. So understanding that Paul is really going and into the lion's den here, as it were, of philosophical thinking and of ideologies about living, and he's facing that. So that's huge, and he's giving a counter answer to that, the real true answer of what's really going to bring a lot of encouragement and help and meaning and purpose to life. But I also want to say this, as he does, and you've mentioned this, he meets them at a level that they're going to appreciate and understand, at least at first, right? Because he's going to use rhetoric and the rhetorical thinking, the rhetorist of the day, and the ability to think and argue in an organized fashion, employing methods of thinking and deduction, and how to present your thoughts publicly, that uses pathos and ethos, of emotion and intellect and all of that, uh, was an art. I mean, rhetoric is an art. And Paul is going to use that in his speech, because the first thing he does is begin to say, "Hey, I've noticed some good things about you," right? He's putting the favorable disposition, the audience at a favorable disposition. "I notice that you're very religious." And then he draws upon the altar in the context of this unknown God. So, yeah, I don't, we'll go into that a little bit more maybe here in just a moment. But didn't mean to go off on a tangent there. But
No, I think we're going the right way. So, I mean, the setting now, I think we've firmly put this in our mind. So Paul's in this kind of middle city. He's in some sense between the Acropolis that's going to be behind him and higher, and the Agora, which is in front of him and lower. And the text says that he's standing in the midst of the Areopagus. That is one of the texts that scholars will talk about it being a council, right? He's standing in the middle of the council. It makes more sense that he's standing there instead of in the middle of a hill, although both are possible. And then he does exactly what John says. He puts them in a good, favorable disposition. He says, "I see that you're religious. I've been here. I've been looking around, and I see that you're religious. And I saw something funny the other day. It was an altar to the unknown God, and he uses that as a launching point to then talk about the God that they don't know, which is true. It's a God that they don't know, and he takes them from that all the way through to a God that's going to supersede all their religious artifacts, but just like John is saying, he starts right where, or just like you're saying, he starts right where they are. So, do you want to talk a little bit about what Paul may have seen when he saw that altar to the unknown God?
yeah, well, first of all, remember in the part one of this discussion, we talked about all of the sanctuaries, the temples, the altars, um, all of these places that were built in religious devotion to these gods. Okay, and the Greek pantheon is so complicated. It is, you have the 12 main Olympian gods, but then from that, right, you have all these other gods that they give birth to. That everything to the god of the winds. I don't know if we mentioned this in our previous section or not, but in the Roman Agora, there is this hexagonal building that has 8 sides to it, that are, and each side has a particular God to that area of the wind. I mean, that's how extreme it is, Brian. That you've got gods that are dedicated to all the different areas that the wind might come from. All right, and then you've got all these, demigods or lesser gods rather, and um, that are over nature, and these nymphs, and on and on and on and on. Right. So, wow, we don't want to offend any god at all, because it has an important part on our commerce, upon our family, upon our business, upon our political affairs, upon our nation or our city state here at Athens. And I mean, every component of our life, right? There's some God that maybe is going to interact with our life and bring some sort of misery to us or whatever if we don't honor them in some way. So then, if we've got all these gods and there's so many we can't even keep track of, maybe there's a God that we don't know about, that we don't want to dishonor in some way. And so Paul speaks of a reference to an altar, right? And an altar is basically just a big block of stone that maybe incense would have been burned on, or maybe fruits would have been offered at the base of it, or whatever, and an inscription. So it's a place of sacrifice to say, we honor you, we respect you, we're worshiping you. And those again were found all over the city to various known gods. But what about those that we don't know about? We miss one, and so this inscription was given. Well, now some debate has come about whether or not these actually existed, because there hasn't been an altar to an unknown god unearthed in Athens, and so people, have some criticism of the Bible. Well, interestingly enough, from both the field of archaeology and from history, ancient historians, we know that they did exist. Now, uh, I don't know. Did you get to see the altar on Palatine Hill at the museum in Rome?
Yeah, I'm gonna maybe tell a little story about that.
Yeah, so
So
there's an altar there. So tell that.
okay, so John's exactly right. So Palatine Hill's in Rome, and there's a little museum there, and in that museum there is an altar to the unknown God. Well, as we're going through, I have to have a picture of this altar, and I wanted it to be nice and in frame and square on. And so my wife may or may not have moved a stanchion so that I could get the exact right shot framed. We put it back. We didn't touch anything, but it was just so I could get the a picture of that altar square on. And so maybe we'll put that picture in the show notes. But it does exist, and it is inscribed to the unknown God, and it's there in Rome. And of course, at the time that Paul is going through Athens, Rome and Athens are very much connected in terms of culture. Rome has influenced Athens, and Athens has influenced the whole world through the Grecian culture.
In fact, I mean that I will mention this just to be fair, because I thought I want to make sure I'm right about this. But the inscription on the altar itself doesn't say unknown God. Now, in the plaque below, you're exactly right. It mentions that, but it's just a reference to worship to deity of some sort, and then the name of the donor that made that possible is mentioned there. But so you've got this altar. We don't know what God it is. No one knows what God it is that they're being. So that's why in the museum it says to an unknown God. But we also know that archaeology has turned up a couple of other of those types of altars in other places. There's been a couple in Turkey that have been found, one at Pergamus that was discovered, and Polymer was discovered there. And then, but then also ancient historians like Pausanias mentions he was a second century AD geographer and historian, and he mentions quite readily that when he'd go from place to place that they're there. And you're right, Brian. I mean, the influence of Greek thinking and ideologies and thoughts about that even affect the Romans, so that we have it in the city of Rome. But yeah, we're afraid that we're going to somehow miss out on a God. I read something, and I can't even remember the reference to it about this. That um, now it's been a number of years ago, that there was even a tradition in Athens of releasing a animal. Did you want to mention something about that? Did you were shaking your head like you remember that, or
Well, I do. This is kind of one of my favorite ideas. And it comes out of the idea that we're not exactly sure how these unknown god altars came about, but what John is referring to is there was a tradition, and I think I've heard it a couple of different ways, but my favorite is that okay, we're having a problem. Maybe there's a plague or famine or something like that, and we're not sure which god is offended. And so what we're going to do is we're going to release a goat or animal of some kind, and we're got to let him wander through the city. And as we've already mentioned, there's altars everywhere in the city, so there's you'd hardly find a place without one. And so wherever the animal lays down or wherever the animal stops, that's the god that we're going to sacrifice to, because that's the indication of the god that's mad at us. Well, as it happened, as the animal meandered through, they found the one place in the whole city that didn't have an altar. And so the concern was there's a God we don't know about. And so we need to erect an altar to that God, and we'll sacrifice the animal, and hopefully that will appease that God that we don't know, and we can get rid of the plague or whatever we seem to be suffering. And so that's one explanation for how an altar could have come about to an unknown God.
so? Yeah, I mean, and now to maybe work that back into the setting, right in the situation. Paul's been in the agora talking about Jesus, talking about the resurrection of the dead, and setting forth this evidence and proof about this and who he was and why they should follow him. And so people hear, oh, he's setting forth strange gods. We've never heard about this. Who's he talking about? What's going on here? And uh, and so they take him to the Areopagus, and there he stands, and they accuse him of being this, sort of seed picker, of picking little elements of philosophy and ideas from various places that he can't think on his own, and so or come up with anything new. And so he puts this all together. And so, what are you saying, Paul? You're the Socrates that are stirring things up now. So, what do you say? And Paul automatically puts them in a favorable disposition by saying, "Look, I see you're very religious. You even have an inscription over here on an altar to an unknown God." And again, what the origin is of that exactly, we're not sure, but we do know they existed. And so now he says, let me tell you about him. I want to tell you about him. And so he uses that as a springboard for a discussion. Doesn't quote any, I know there's debate about this. He doesn't quote specifically any Old Testament passages, but I think there are references to the Old Testament and things that he's talking about here, particularly this high God, this God above all gods that created all things. Because even in Greek philosophy and thinking, they did have some that they thought were greater and larger on top of, the sort of the chief pantheon of gods. Even in the Canaanite religion, we see that in a lot of different places. But also, I want to maybe mention something else here. I think there are people, I know there are people in Greece and scattered around Rome that already adopted this idea of a one true God, of monotheism. And I think that came from the influences of Judaism, right? They're worshipers of God. Who was Cornelius in Acts 10? We see about this in at Corinth when when Luke mentions this as well. You've got people who are already saying, you know what? Yeah, there is this God out there. Well, that we worship. There's one God. Uh, even Greek philosophy called something the logos. They said it was this reason that existed out there. They didn't make it approachable or maybe something tangible that you could connect with, but they saw that there was something out there that brought all of this together, and they called it the logos. And of course, John's going to speak on that in John chapter 1 about, let me tell you about the true logos. So it's interesting to think about the interconnectedness of Greek philosophy, ideas, practices, religion, and the Bible. And yet now what Paul and others are going to do is say, let me correct the misconceptions and false ideologies and thoughts out there to tell you about the one true living God.
So that's exactly what he's going to do. Obviously, he's going to transition from what they know to what they don't know. And again, that's a great principle just in general for how to talk to anybody about any subject. Let's find something we agree on and something we know about, and then let's move into things that we can discuss. And I don't think we're going to go through the whole text, line by line, but just to summarily give some of the points. The first thing he says is that there is a God who made everything. This unknown God made everything, and as far as I understand, this very much appeals to the Stoic idea, that there was a God that created everything. And then he kind of hits them with
And that
his
may be
first.
that logos idea, by the way, that I was
Right.
just talking about, right, so go ahead.
Yeah, that logos, or there was one deity, and then the interesting thing about the Stoic philosophy is he didn't interact, right? There was no interaction with this logos or this superseding deity. And so there's a lot of ways that Paul's going to challenge their thinking, but the first one is right out of the gate with the Athenian mind, at least, and it is he doesn't live in temples made with hands. And of course, the Athenians had nothing but temples made with hands. If he's standing on the Areopagus, which again I think there's good evidence for, I almost see him gesturing either behind him to the Acropolis where the Pantheon is and the statue to Athena, or he could be gesturing in front of him into the Agora where there's all of these temples and all of these altars and where he just came from, and he's saying the God that made everything doesn't live in temples made with hands. And he doesn't need your idols or your temples or anything like that, because he is the Lord of heaven, and he does not either live in temples made with hands, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything. He, on the other hand, gives. Go ahead.
No, no, I'm just saying that, something that I had a question about a long time ago, when I heard that or read it, really resonated with me thinking, well, wait a minute. Well, what about the God of the Bible in the Old Testament? Doesn't he live in temples? Right? He's in a temple in Jerusalem. And now Paul's saying, no, he doesn't live in temples made with hands. Well, the point is that he doesn't. That's not the temple or the tabernacle before isn't where God lives. That's where you meet God. That's where they met God, where he made a provision under the old covenant to come and commune with God. And he descended, but remember, even when, and I always forget if it was David or Solomon, when they're talking about the temple, and they said, now we know, even David recognized, we know that no temple can hold you, God. And even when, like Isaiah saw God coming to manifest himself in the temple, and just the train of his kingly robe as it fills, just the tip of it fills, right? They can't even minister there. So uh, that's Paul's point is that the temple in Jerusalem, the temple, the tabernacle before was just a meeting place. In fact, that's what the word tabernacle meant. It was a meeting place. So what Paul is saying, your gods are confined to these and relegated to these buildings, but not the one true God who made everything. He can't be confined to that. I
Well, and he goes on to tell the Corinthians, which in our geography is just down the road, that if he tells the Athenians they're not made in temples made with hands, he tells the Corinthians that you are the temple of God in part, that part of him dwells in you. And I don't want to get into that too much, but the point is that's not a temple made with hands. He's saying that you can't make a place for him to dwell, but he chooses to have a relationship with you, a theme that he's going to draw on later in this sermon too. But it's very interesting to think about how this would have changed their perception of God.
in fact, that's what I think. I'm sorry. That's one of the things that is ironic about this. This is an inscription to the unknown God, but the unknown God whom they ignorantly worship is knowable. He's not unknown. He is knowable. And okay, well, how do we know him? What does Paul argue about then? What's one of the evidences, Brian, that you see in the text there about that he offers for how we can know this God, and where is he? How can we see him?
Paul's going to give a lot of response to that, but in one thing he talks about the fact that he created everything, and that creation speaks towards a God that wants to have a relationship with us. And he goes on, especially, God is not far from one of us, that we may seek towards him and perhaps find our way to him through both the creation, but also the fact that he's going to ultimately talk about, or I think he's heading there. We'll talk a little bit in a second whether he gets cut off or not. But I think he's ultimately going to talk about Jesus and the resurrection and those themes right there. And he's leading them on a path to know God through the
Yeah.
things that they observe, through the things that they can reason themselves towards, and then ultimately towards the things that they've undoubtedly heard about, the events that occurred in Jerusalem.
Yeah. And that's exactly right. So through reason, through observation of the creation, that things just don't come about as the result of an accident. Like the psalmist said in Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God and the firmament shows his handiwork. But the apex of that creation is humanity. And he then draws upon evidence from their own philosophers, which again is a great mark of, a rhetorical style, to say, all right, I'm going to use, an argument that you have yourself made. And that is, are we not the offspring of God? He's not far from any one of us, for it is in him that we live and move and have our very being, even as your own poets have said, right, that we are his offspring. So, in other words, look at the apex of creation, humanity, and see that we are made in his image. Well, what is man like? Man is intelligent, has the ability to think, can be moral, all of these things. And by the way, man has an immortal soul, right? So all of these things reflect something about the creator. He's not far from any one of us. If we just go look for him, he is there. Now, that would have been also, I think, very exciting to some elements of Greek thinking and philosophers to think, because the idea that the Greeks had, of some of them, that man is the measure of all things. He's the ideal person. What does he look like? Who is he? Well, we have meaning, we have purpose, because we reflect those characteristics inherent in a divine being with the greatest virtue. Think about this: the greatest virtue of honesty, truth, and love, which especially the virtues of honesty and integrity and reason are things that the Greek world would have valued. And so to think about that connection is pretty powerful. So Paul's offering arguments here, saying he doesn't dwell in temples made with hands, right? He's not far from any one of us. Look at the tangible world. Look at the world that we're living in. He is saying, I am here. I am not silent. I exist. And I am also something that's very exciting. And you may want to say something else, and I'm going to come back to this, because what he reveals about this God as being knowable, and what he says about him is to me very attractive and exciting, and must have been attractive and was attractive to some of the people at that day. But go ahead.
We've kind of folded in mythology to one of the things, some of the things we've talked about. And, you even asked the question when we got to Socrates, why does that matter? Why is that important? Well, the Greeks and the Romans, and their opinion of their deities, was pretty low. They embody man-like qualities. They are capricious. They are prone to jealousy and anger and whims and these kind of things. And then, in some regard, they are aloof or separated from humanity, only interacting when their mood strikes. And Paul is not only making an argument for the existence of God. He says once you figure out that this God exists, he calls you into a relationship with him. If we're his offspring, then you can embrace him as father. You can embrace him as a benevolent deity, to use the Roman terms. But he's not only knowable, but he is also not like these other gods that you would know. He is someone who wants to have a relationship with you and wants to give you the benefits of that relationship.
Boy, and that is such a powerful point. I think what a lot of people miss about Acts 17 is that he is presenting this God who is generous, verse 25. He's powerful, verse 23. He actually makes promises, right? If you read in verse 31, he gives assurance. Um, and then I'm going to add this, and this would have, I think, really been appealing to the Greek thinkers who, in thinking about some of the great philosophers like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, who took up the topic of justice. What is right? How do we make a judgment about criminal cases, or about law proceedings? And I mean, the Areopagus is an example of that, right? That, all right, we're going to hear trials. We're going to that if you're a citizen of Athens, you have rights, and a right to be heard and a right to be brought before a judicial court. So justice was a huge part of Greek thinking, which, by the way, has influenced in America today, right? And so democratic societies, all that was going on there has had so many, a ripple effect down through time for our own democracy. Justice, we value justice. We want right, and we want mercy, of course, but we value the justice system. So now, what does Paul says? He gets down to the end of his speech and he says, "This God, when he judges, he's not like, as you've already mentioned, whimsical or capricious, right? And just flies off the handle. But this God is righteous, that he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he hath ordained." So, okay, now I want to know something more about this God who judges in righteousness. What man is that? It's the man that Paul has been preaching about in the Agora, right? He's been preaching about Jesus. Well, John tells us in John chapter 1 that Jesus came to explain or declare God unto us, to be the exegete of God. And then John 14, when Thomas and Philip are asking and conversing with Jesus, well, show us the Father, it will satisfy us. And Jesus said, have you not known me? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So, wow, I can know God, and he's not far from any one of us. There's evidence of him. He is the one true living God. He doesn't dwell within temples made with hands. He is a God of righteousness and judgment, and he's a God that came in the person of Jesus Christ, God dwelling among us. Can you imagine? He took up flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. And then this God did something that is unthinkable. He died for humanity. He died for humanity, not like the gods of the Greek and Roman world. This is a God that's intimate, a God that cares, a God that represents justice and righteousness and goodness. And then this also, I think, as you kind of come to the end of the speech, and you may want to say something else here, this is what then ruffled the feathers of some of the, I guess, in particular, maybe the Stoics or the Epicureans. I always forget, maybe both of them. And that is, okay, he was resurrected. What? No way. This is a one-way ticket. Life, you go from this life to the next. You don't go back and forth. And then also a lot of Greek philosophy and thought, as we've already said, is the emancipation of the soul from the body. And now you're going to have him come back in a body. What? That is okay. We've heard enough of this, right? So the speech gets interrupted.
You know, I see a lot of parallels between this and the Corinthian letter. I already mentioned one talking about, the what kind of temple God lives in, but one of the linchpins of Paul's argument in Corinthians is an entire section on the resurrection and what it means for the Christian and what it means for us to understand the resurrection. Well, Paul is trying to use that very same argument as the linchpin in his discussion with these people, is that he's given assurance. Well, how did he provide that assurance? Well, he raised somebody from the dead. And just like you're saying, that was so against their understanding and so foreign from their thinking that they stopped him, or did he run out of time? You want to talk about
Okay.
that for a second?
Yeah. Yeah. Boy, do we need this next thing we're going to talk about. I'm telling you. So, yeah, one of the things that I think maybe is a small, perhaps, connection to Paul's speech here, and something that we got to see when you go to the museum there at the Stoa of Atlas, the one that's been reconstructed there in the Agora that we've all been talking about to this point. So there's a really neat museum. Be sure you go in and visit that. So a ticket into the Agora, the Agora again, Greek pronunciation. You go in there and you see all these different the remains of these temples and buildings and all that, and this really cool place. But then that reconstructed building has some really neat prized artifacts in it, and pottery showing the kind of the ancient Greek Mycenaean connection, and what they believed, and athletes that are running, and on depictions of stuff like that on pottery, and all kinds of neat things. There's a voting booth kind of device in there, and I wish I were smart enough to be able to describe it to you, but they had a way of if you're casting a vote, right? And but then there is, in this one glass case, you walk up and it's two pots. Do you remember seeing it, Brian? And there's just two pots, a larger pot and a smaller pot down below. And at the larger pot, there's a small hole, and then on the smaller pot down below, are there some lines in there inside the pot. And so what basically it is, it's an ancient water clock, and they would fill the larger pot on top, and then the water would empty out in that little hole down below of the big pot and into the smaller pot. And so whenever they would use that as a means of measuring time, particularly in regard to speeches. And this was used, and we know from historians that water clocks were used in particularly judicial situations where maybe a witness would come and get a chance to speak. We also know at the Pnyx, where the ecclesia met, uh, that people had opportunity to speak, but their time was measured. Their time was measured, and so the way they could measure it, because they didn't have a good old Timex. Well, I don't have a Timex, but a good old watch, right, to be able to measure time. And so they'd pour water in there, and then when the water ran out of the big pot and down into the lower pot, and got to a certain point in the level there, the marking, you had to stop. And some say that, based on this water clock that was found in the agora down below the Areopagus there, that it took 6 minutes to fill that pot below. 6 minutes. So that was about the amount of time that were given to speak. Well, how long is Paul's speech? Not very long. I timed it not long ago. I decided I would read it with feeling and slowly, and it only took me about 2.5 minutes. So the question then becomes, well, was Paul interrupted? Did he finish his speech? I mean, it's not a very long speech, is it, Brian?
No.
And yet, I also got to thinking about this one day. Some of the greatest speeches in the history of the world have been very short. All right. I don't know if some come to your mind, but one comes to my mind is the Gettysburg Address, even shorter than this one, right? And how many speeches or bits of prose that have influenced the world and changed the thinking of the world have been very short. This one's very short, and yet it's packed full of all of this stuff. We spent how long talking about it? We've just touched the hem of the garment, right? Okay. So the question is, well, did Paul get his full 6 minutes? Was he allotted 6 minutes? Was he given any amount of time? Did he say what he needed to say? Was he interrupted here? It seems like he was interrupted. Maybe he would have gotten to the point of the new birth, and to talk a little bit more about that, I don't know, but uh, it ends. But the great conclusion is, if you want to say anything more about that before we kind of wrap up with what happens at the end here.
I mean, exactly what you're saying, and I think we're headed this way anyway. But I want to make some connections, and there's a lot of modern connections to this one, and one that's maybe trivial, but maybe not. I think about you mentioned at the outset the Bear Valley lectures. We just had this entire lectureship, and the theme was in igniting the church's love for preaching. Well, one of the hallmarks of preaching, or you and I have talked about it when we're doing videos, when we're doing anything, is the ability to say what you need to say in the shortest amount of time possible. Or of course, at 55 minutes into the podcast, this might not be a good time to talk about
No kidding.
the
Yeah.
shortest amount of time possible. But Paul was able to really craft a sermon and a uh, reasoned defense where every word and every sentence had a large impact. You know, he was able to put the ideas and philosophies that he wanted to capture into a really short space. And I think, you know, sometimes as preachers, sometimes as um, readers of the Bible, I'm often struck with the brevity of certain accounts. You know, you think that the account of you know, maybe David and Goliath is this big long drawn out thing, and you look down and it's, you know, a couple short verses, and I'm just struck with how compact things that are both in the Bible and in these speech sections. And so I think as we start to make transition into our application.
Brian, before you go on to that, let me just, and you're right, but I want to mention uh, in the at the museum what they say in the little plaque below. It says the water clock description says the following: an experienced speaker adjusted his speech to coincide with the last drop, so he had it timed perfectly. An experienced speaker. It was an art and efficient. So anyway, go ahead.
Well, and I mean that's just more evidence to what I'm kind of hinting at here is that the we don't need to be long-winded, we don't need to be verbose, but to think about what we want to say and be able to have a reasoned argument that doesn't take, you know, 20 hours to explain, is exactly how we're called to be. And there's power in the simplicity of what Paul has to say. I mean, he didn't for us reading in our context, Paul didn't necessarily say anything earth shattering. He said that there is a God, he made everything, you can look at everything and you can reason his existence. He wants to have a relationship with you. And then he's done. And that's, you know, and well, in that last piece that we're talking about right now, he gives evidence of that relationship that he wants to have through the resurrection. He wants to have that relationship with you. And so sometimes, and this is really where I'm going, sometimes we overcomplicate what is can be a simple message. Um, Paul very succinctly says a lot of things in this 2.5 minute speech.
I love what you said earlier, and what we must continue to try to emphasize as well as we interact with people is to take them where they are. You know, where are they in their understanding? Maybe to try to couch things in words that they understand, as Paul was doing here, but to also never lose sight of the greatness of God, but also the nearness of God, the fact that he offers this relationship, that we can connect with him, that we can know him. That's appealing, you know. And then, you know, to have purpose and meaning of life. Is there a standard to live by? Is there right and wrong? Is there justice? You know, all the things that we still struggle with and talk about today. Uh, God is the answer. He answers all those questions that we started out with. You know, who am I? Where am I going? What's life about? And Paul, yeah, so beautifully answers all of those.
Well, and you know, I think as we start to make more connections and more applications, the first one is I mean, glaring right in the face, and I don't want to skip over the simple application, and that is if you have not uncovered a relationship with God, you have to know that that's something that He wants for you. I mean, if you are listening to the podcast and you don't know exactly what we're talking about, um, God wants to have a relationship with you the same way that Paul says he wanted to have a relationship with the Athenians. He's still seeking that. He's still looking for that, and there are ways that we can uncover what the obligations of that relationship are. And I don't want to skip over that fact. But for the people who are listening who do have that relationship, it's not something that we should take for granted. In another passage, it says that friendship with the world is enmity with God. Well, we really have two choices, and it's the same choice that the Athenians had. They had the gods of the world, and they had the one true living God. And the gods of the world didn't satisfy. Much like the unknown God, there'll be um, things that we haven't even conceived of yet that may take precedence in our lives, or we may be seeking more wealth or more pleasure or more whatever. Instead, there is a God who has given us everything we need, including that assurance in the resurrection. And so we're given the same choice. And we, like you're saying, Paul presents a very appealing picture of a relationship with a God who's loving, who's righteous, who's able to make promises that he's able to keep, unlike some of the things in the world, everything in the world that we have.
And that's really how the Bible begins in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, is showing this God, chapter 1, that is all powerful, that speaks the world into existence, says, let there be light, and there is light. And then in chapter 2, the emphasis upon how he created Adam then and Eve. And it's very intimate, right? He breathes into him the breath of life. He sees that it's not good for him to be alone. So he takes a rib from the side of man and he crafts a woman. He puts them in a place where, provide their needs. So he's a provider. So it shows this multifaceted nature of God that we must not lose sight of, right? His sovereignty and yet his intimacy and his goodness. And he's knowable and he wants to be known and he wants to be in fellowship with us. And in the process of that, what we have to do is dispel the false ideologies and philosophies of the world, particularly as Paul was doing then. And I wrote an article, and we're doing a Bible connections about this, a video Bible connections about this that should be coming out in the next few months. But it's what made Paul so angry, right? The text began with when Paul was in Athens, his spirit was stirred within him when he saw the city wholly given to idolatry. Well, was Paul just kind of a hothead? He just didn't like, I don't like all these idols, and it's taken away from God. Well, yeah, that's true to a large extent, but I think there's something more, and that is that these people were being robbed of a relationship with the one true God who is good, who is holy. These people were being robbed of a true inner peace and a life hereafter. And when I think about even today, people who are being robbed of the hope of eternal life or being robbed of this connection with God and who are being enslaved to the philosophies of the world and to denominational doctrines that are even opposed to what God reveals about himself and who he is, that we can know God, that I can know that I'm saved, right? And on things that shackle people. The pure gospel, and one that we're seeking to teach and preach, is undenominational, it's non-denominational, it's anti-denominational. It's just one that says, let's go back to the Bible, and the Bible that points us to God, and to have this unshackled, unfettered relationship with God, free from creeds, free from the philosophies of the world. We want to learn as much as we can about all that, as we've been talking about here, so that we understand the context in which people live and the world in which they live. But to get back to simple, pure Christianity and knowing God, the God of love.
Wow, and that's such a great point, and I'm glad you made those connections. And again, I'm going to give you anything else you have on Athens here in just a second. But as we're kind of winding this down, I hope you see that as we're uncovering the history and the geography and the historical setting of Paul's speech, that it's more than just something that happened in history at a point in time, that it's something that has rippling impacts all the way into our own culture and our own setting and our own context. And that's really what we want to try to bring out. So as we wrap this up, John, do you have anything that we missed on Athens? Anything we need
Well,
to
I would just say that if you ever get to go there, hopefully with us, and you stand up there on that hill, the Areopagus of, whether or not they met there, we talked about all that. Look around and take it all in and understand, as you've noted, the geography, the geographical and the historical context. What would Paul have seen? What did he see? All those temples, all those places, all the philosophies. I mean, that's such a great place to be. So don't miss it. Go there and just spend a few moments absorbing that and trying to, get into the text and to make those connections like that. It's really a neat place. I know some people, I've heard people say, well, I've been there, I don't want to go back. I want to go back. And I go back more and more because I want to look more deeply into the Word of God and say, well, I can't get back there. Okay. Well, there's so many sources that you can study and read and learn about to draw you in, into the text a little more deeply. With what purpose? So that we can know God on a more intimate level.
John and I want to thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Bible Passages podcast. One of the missions of Bible Passages is to deliver as much free Bible content to people as possible, but we can't do that without your support. First, you can like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or on YouTube. Second, you can leave a comment on this video or this episode so that we know that you're listening. And third, if you feel compelled to give, you can do so at BiblePassages.net/give. Thank you so much for your support, and we'll see you in the next episode.